Hello guys, welcome to the Bright Agent. Today we are going to be studying some English literature quotes. In this series, I'll be doing 3 different texts that you need to study. Spectacles, Macbeth, and The Christmas Carol. And I'm not really going to do love and relationships from the poetry anthology or unseen poetry just yet, because I'm going to be doing it in the paper order. So like Shakespearean stuff, then the 19th century novel, then the dramatic plays, then love and relationships, then unseen poetry. That's the order I'll do it in. Just stay tuned right now. So, the thing that we need to know is quotes. You cannot make an argument in English literature with just using just plain words. So, in fact, you have to use a combination of quotes which are your main backup or evidence for an argument. Then you have to use different techniques and then explain it and just refer to how it affects the reader or why the writer has used those techniques. One main problem with this system is that it makes people do, oh, there's a point, I'll just write about a point, without actually thinking how that point links back to the moral or the message that certain aspect of the play or story is going to bring. So, with all these quotes, I want you to just bring it in mind that you should use those quotes for techniques and to back up your point. But remember, just put a bit of writer's purpose at the start. Just use it for your point. That way the examiners can clearly see that you have a clear-cut point that will lead straight to your evidence. And then it strengthens the relevance or the reader or the explanation that you're going to give. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, for Macbeth, my first quote is the vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself. Now, Macbeth does say this in Act 1, and that's also going to be in either Scene 4 or Scene 5. But the thing you need to know is that overleaping ambition acts as foreshadowing to his downfall. The start of his downfall is caused by his overleaping ambition. You can argue that from being a noble warrior to being described as a butcher in Act 5, Scene 8, you can argue that this acts as foreshadowing or the stepping stone to his downfall. And you can also use this for kingship to show that you can argue that ambition is necessary for monarchs or rulers. But if it's excessive to the point where it overleaps itself, and you could argue that overleap itself is like the metaphor of a horse that overexerts itself, and to the point where it falls over, actually hints that it's excessive. But one thing perceptive students who do this, or analyze this quote, they realise that, it overleaps itself. I have no spur, but my vaulting ambition. The spur is not Macbeth. Because the spur is not Macbeth. In fact, the spur is his ambition, but the rider is Lady Macbeth, if you think about it. Because he has the ambition, but the spur is not enough to drive him to the point where he completely changes character and he becomes a butcher. It's actually Lady Macbeth who emasculates him and drives him to that point. So it's very important to know that when you're studying this. And in addition, the plosives also provide a very sinister and brutal tone, the same way that Macbeth is going to be foreshadowed as having a sinister and brutal character. That's what you could argue. You could also link it to how this transforms him into being bloody or avaricious, as later mentioned in somewhere in Act 4. But the main purpose of this is, this ambition allows us to not only study the qualities of a king, but actually allows us to analyse how good of a person Macbeth was. Not is, because he later becomes evil and dies, but it really does allow a lot of interpretations, and does allow us to bring a bit of Lady Macbeth in, hence why it's a pretty good quote to use. Another quote that you could use is, "Fair is foul, and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and the filthy air." Now, a lot of people do remember this quote, and some people even remember it even without studying Macbeth itself. But the reason why this is such a good quote to use is because the fricatives with a fair is foul and a jarring tone that emphasizes the witch's cruelty and unnatural power, which in the Jacobean era, the audience would have seen as going against God or going against God's natural order. So the fricatives emphasize that. But that's not the only thing you need to analyse, since only looking at the fricatives would be a poor analysis of the quote. What you need to look at is, fair is foul and foul is fair. This foreshadows how Macbeth's usurping of Duncan shapes all the fair things into being foul, which destroys the natural order of Scotland, and foul becomes fair because he is trying to just murder everyone to keep himself in power. And in addition, it also marks the sinister nature or tone of Macbeth, because it does add a jarring noise, the fricatives do. But what you could argue is that also marks the arrival of Macbeth, because later on in Macbeth, one of the witches says, "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." And that's not because they're just saying it just to rhyme, as they always do, which adds even more of a sinister and unnatural tone. They're doing is marking the arrival of Macbeth, and if you tie those two quotes together, you can see how Macbeth's presence makes things foul rather than fair, and how he destroys the natural order of what God ordained Scotland to be. And therefore, to restore that balance, to make everything fair, his downfall has to be executed. So, essentially speaking, what you could argue is that it marks the beginning of the witches encountering Macbeth, and it also acts as a contrast to the noble warrior he is presented as, because if you look closely, him being a noble warrior, fighting for his country and the king, is actually a symbol of him restoring God's order, or just obeying God by getting rid of any opposition, as a punishment for those who keep on sinning and keep on destroying the balance. Although it is foreshadowed that Macbeth will later destroy that balance, and by pairing those two quotes together, to actually create a powerful synergy for the supernatural and maybe fate as well, because the supernatural is just a theme which occurs throughout the poem, and you could argue that the witches mention Macbeth by foreshadowing him and foreshadowing Macbeth's continual visits which makes Scotland fouler. However, for a perceptive analysis, what you could say is that since the witches use iambic pentameter, for example, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and the filthy air, you could argue that it adds like a childlike tone, and in addition it just makes them seem more like foolish rather than actual threat they were presented in a Jacobean era, because witches were presented as people who defied God, people who defied societal norms of the time, and by using those and using iambic pentameter, you can argue that they're kind of powerless in a way, that their rhymes make them seem childish, because their constant rhyming may bring sinister undertones, but in fact actually undermines their power, because fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and the filthy air. Because while they are talking about that, it actually makes the use of fricatives actually adds a bit of frivolity in a way, as in a way which like softens atmosphere in a way. So if you said fair is foul and foul is fair, the F's actually make it, you could argue that the F sounds make it sound more light-hearted or comedic, rather than something that is grave or serious. Now, the final part of the quote that I want to pick out is that the fog and the filthy air foreshadows the poisoning of Scotland, because fog, filthy air, as in Macbeth, dirty Scotland. He, instead of the cleansing, as a contrast to the cleansing that God provides to other people, to people of Scotland, Macbeth actually dirties it by engaging in supernatural affairs, which therefore means that he actually acts as an impurity in Scotland, instead of being pure and noble and a valiant warrior. So you can argue that this quote not only demonstrates the power of the witches, also demonstrates the powerlessness of the witches, and it can also make readers question why Macbeth fell into their trap of equivocation, because this childish nature that's presented through this quote makes Macbeth seem a foolish person. Not foolish in like being equivocating into, because sometimes we are all equivocating into things, but the main point of this is that if you look into this quote, you'll realise that Macbeth eventually gets equivocated and does things which have a double meaning. So actually Macbeth could be presented as childish himself for falling for those childish, foolish tricks that the witches provide. That's what you could argue alongside with her power. That would easily get you into level 4 and level 5. And if you manage to bridge them together, maybe add one more quote that related to the fog and the filthy air, then maybe that will get you into level 6. But even if it's level 4 or level 5, we are actually getting somewhere with this quote. Another quote that I would like to share is "Out damn spot, hell is murky." Now, the out damn spot, out I say, hell is murky. Now, if you look at those imperative and the exclamation marks, it symbolizes Lady Macbeth's attempt to bring the spirits back in control, and to actually control herself and retain the power and mental stability that she once had when she was gathering the spirits. You could also argue this links to, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, and unset me here." You could link those exclamation marks from that quote to this quote, her once again trying to establish her authority over the spirits by becoming more masculine, more powerful, and more bloodthirsty in order to influence Macbeth. But you could also argue that instead of establishing her authority, you could argue that it's an act of desperation to try get herself back in control. And upon realizing that she has fallen into the clutches of divine punishment, as in one last final plea, "Out, damn Spot." Instead of "Out, damn Spot," "Out, I say." Which presents itself as powerful because imperatives. Do it. Go ahead. Dress up. They're usually to show command or authority. But that could also show desperation because she knows that authority cannot be placed or used by her anymore because now she's experiencing the wrath of God. The damn Spot also refers to the blood, to the little blood on hand, but could also metaphorically refer to the guilt that she has experienced due to Duncan's regicide. And damned and hell in this quote could refer to the divine punishment and is more likely that, or as a taste, a foretaste of what she is going to experience in hell for breaking God's natural order, because women were presented as subservient or inferior to men at this contemporary time. So this contrast early on in the play suggests she has power. She eventually has broken societal norms by eventually breaking through the stereotypical image of women having no power and no authority as the men did, or any influence that the men did. But you could link it back to that to show that while she does have power, it is only presented as temporary, because any illicit means to gain power from the supernatural, from the devil, or anything related to demonic forces will eventually be overpowered or overridden by divine punishment that she experiences. And Hell is Murky also refers to that as well, because this means that she can no longer see clearly or experience life clearly or have a clear mental state of mind, because those spirits, while giving her more power, eventually, ironically, lead to her weakness, lead to her downfall, where she eventually kills herself. So that power which she gains is contrasted by the weakness near the end of the play. So you could argue that Out That Spot, Out I Say, Hell is Murky could refer to how, if people in society try to defy God's law or God's order, or try to break free from God and just reject Him, or try to gain power, then they eventually are divinely punished. They will experience the madness that Lady Macbeth experiences, and this advises the audience not to kill the king, which causes this imbalance. And by plaguing Lady Macbeth with this punishment, the balance is somewhat restored, although it's not fully restored because Macbeth also took part in the regicide. In addition, you could argue that the plosives add the harshness, exacerbate the harshness of the punishment, exacerbate her loss of power at this stage in the play. Therefore, you could use this quote. Link it back to that, and then you could say, all the sweet perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand, oh, which is a lamentation. The O was used to signify a sense of lamentation, and showcases the extent of the suffering she is enduring for her actions. And this can also be contrasted with her saying, a little water clears us of the steed. After Macbeth says, all the great seas of Neptune will not wash this blood. And then you can link it back to how ironic it is that her guilt will not be washed away of her breaking that divine order, because she has defied God and defied the king as well. And that guilt can't simply be washed away. It stays in her mind. And that is what Shakespeare is trying to teach audience. That even if people think that they can get away with defying God, they will eventually succumb to their actions that they have committed and experience punishment because of going against this. Another quote I'd like to share with you is, out, brief candle. Out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets upon the stage and is heard no more. Now, Shakespeare, you may have used this quote to exemplify Macbeth's state of mind throughout the play. First off, he starts off as confident and a noble, brave, valiant warrior whose sword smokes with bloody execution, before becoming more ill and mad due to his regicide encountering Banquo's ghost. And then you could also argue that he switches to desperation later on in Act 4 and now in Act 5, where he says, out, brief candle. The candle refers to life. Life is brief. Life is short. Life doesn't matter. And a poor player refers to a bad actor who is heard no more because he does not live his life well. He does not fulfill the purpose of life. And in fact, one could argue that Macbeth is referring to himself, since he might be saying that he has not lived his life well due to the guilt and the pain that the regicide has caused him. The plosives and throughout this quote could also emphasize Macbeth's sense of nihilism, that life doesn't matter. And this would also go against the idea of sanctity of life, where you usually want to preserve your life, and that life is sacred, life is meaningful. You can link that idea to that. As opposed to this acts as a contrast to Macbeth's nihilism, because he thinks that life is meaningless. The candle could also refer to the taper that was brought to Lady Macbeth, which then you could also link to hell is murky, because the taper is referred to as a source of metaphorical light. Although to obtain that light is too late for her, that she has plunged herself into that metaphorical darkness, which makes her murky. And then you could bring it back to that point to say that experience of having that metaphorical light is brief. life's joys are brief, and life being a walking shadow, you could also link that back to stars hide your fires, that light not seen by black and deep desires, to showcase how he briefly was in light. And light is a biblical allusion to holiness or sacredness in the Bible. You could then refer that back to life's but a walking shadow, because it means that life is a walking shadow. As in, Macbeth is plunged into darkness to the extent where he sees life as meaningless and pointless, completely fruitless, and not worthy of any value anymore. A poor player who struts and frets upon the stage suggests that all he has been doing to try cover up the regicide, to cover himself up by saying that try cover up his black and deep desires, which could be an allusion to the devil who brings people out of light into the metaphorical darkness, who steals, kills, and destroys. Macbeth could use this as a point of realization that his life has been destroyed, or perhaps as a point of desperation, a thought of pensiveness possibly, because he's reflecting over the events that have occurred in this play. He could be referring to, I've covered myself up. The light that I once had, the potential I once had to be a good king, to be a good leader, is now gone. And now the strutting and fretting could be referred to the worries or the pitfalls of life that he had in just trying to cover up himself as an avaricious attempt, a false attempt. This highlights the fact that Macbeth has not been a good king, because to be a good king, you do not kill needlessly, because he stepped so far in blood. That's a quote that you could also link back to it. He stepped so far in blood that he has to murder more innocent people in order to sustain his tyranny. And then heard no more. And then is heard no more. This means this could be a sense of foreshadowing. And then is heard no more is a sense of foreshadowing, because in Macbeth is referring to his own life. Shakespeare could be using this to showcase his downfall, because he is heard no more. Apart from the moment where he's referred to as a dead butcher and his fiend-like queen, which is Lady Macbeth, he is heard no more. He is not seen or experienced any longer, because his tyranny, his brutal reign of bloodshed has been overcome and restored and been restored. God's natural right has been just restored by Malcolm, who is demonstrated to be a good king, having bounty, and this could potentially show through him having virtues that please his angels, like his father Duncan. It could reflect the potential that he has. But going back to this quote, this should link the contrast of temporary power, temporary tyranny will come to an end, and all your efforts, when they come to an end, they won't be heard anymore. They will be finished. To restore the balance, goodness is remembered. Goodness is restored in that moment of darkness, and people may not remember that anymore. So this could refer a Jacobean audience. Shakespeare wants them to learn that for those who seek illicit power, life can be futile. And life can be futile if you seek illicit power and try to overcome and try to conceal your sin or to conceal your wrongdoing with more wrongdoing, people will later reflect on it and look on it as wrong. So, Shakespeare may be arguing that being a good king will remove that position entirely, since their life will be full of goodness rather than experience the consequences of being avaricious and dying, or experience divine punishment that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have experienced. You could definitely link that as a strong quote for kingship. You can link that to show that being a good king and linking that to being a good person in Jacobean society will not lead to you having these nihilistic views. Because if you do not reject God, then your life will not be rejected, and you will reject life as well, because God is experienced to be seen as the giver of life. So essentially speaking, the message of this is to learn that being a good person and being a good king will save you from all of the darkness if you do not engage in the instruments of darkness or with the instruments of darkness, if you do not tap into the supernatural, if you obey the divine right of kings and follow the natural order, then the balance will be maintained and you will not have to have a nihilistic life that's full of worry. So that's it for the quotes today for Macbeth. I have covered 4 because I wanted to cover them in extreme detail. I just didn't want to go over way too much in a massive span of time, because going over the quotes really quickly will only provide a basic interpretation, like level 1, level 2, level 3 at best, I guess. I wanted to cover with deep analysis to get us up from that level 3 and level 4 slump to maybe high level 4, level 5, and level 6 if you're really engaging with a quote. Engage with the techniques. If you notice a plosive, say that it means that it creates a harsh and brutal effect. But you can't just use those words. You have to realise what the effect connotates on what certain object or noun or whatever is trying to present itself as. And language is also pretty important in Macbeth. But remember, stick to the theme. If you get something about kingship, which has never come up in an exam before, as of now, as I speak, if you come up with kingship, or the supernatural, or faith and free will, or whatever, use language, because language is very important in most texts that you do. But remember, stick to the theme. Sticking to the theme, understanding the writer's intentions of Macbeth, understanding the divine right of kings and natural order, and maybe King James's obsession with witchcraft, him creating demonology. You can use that as powerful context, because I see Macbeth as more of like a language and context heavy piece of text than anything. So if you're to remember anything, remember these, and this will really take you far. I may have only touched on 4 quotes. I'm not saying you should use those 4 quotes for absolutely everything. Don't just, I'll just place this here. If you know you can use it, go ahead. Use a variety of quotes. I'm not restricting you to the quotes that I just said. Feel free to expand on those quotes. If there's anything I've missed, leave it down in the comments. And if there's and I expect you to note these things down so that you can remember it and revise it and continually put it in your essay. So that way you can get the highest mark possible at Macbeth. Reach 19 or 20 marks at least, excluding the spag box, which you'll hopefully get for it. But the point is, remember this. Note it down. Remember to link to the themes. Remember to link to the context. And remember to use language. And while I thought Macbeth was bad, since I got 17 out of 34, one time in year 11, I've now got 32 out of 34. And you can do the same. If you normally revise those quotes, revise other quotes. Look into the same analysis. Look into the same language. Look at all the things I've mentioned, and you will go far. And you can literally apply this to any other text too. So it's not only Macbeth, which you could just use language, context, evidence, explanation. Applying this to any other text, and you will go far in those texts too. And I hope you enjoyed this Macbeth quote session. And be bright, stay right, like, subscribe, and comment. And I hope you share this if you found this helpful. I hope you comment if I've missed anything, and if you'd like me to analyze any quotes you've got in the comments. Like and subscribe, and have a good day.